Okay, perfect. Thanks, Dave. So I've jumped into my FortiEDR console, where you can see it's it's delivered as a SaaS service or as an on-premise or sort of a hybrid type deployment. So that in effect allows us to kind of track our endpoints, whether they're on the network or kind of off the network. But if I go into kind of our security policies to kind of really highlight that key point that you just made there, Dave, around sort of moving on from just doing sort of antivirus protection. So antivirus protection was all about preventing an endpoint from getting compromised in the first place. But then if it did get compromised, it was kind of too late. You had no idea what was then happening post-compromise. But then also similarly, if you did get infected, or maybe the endpoint protection solution actually flagged up and said, hey, yep, we've got malware on that endpoint, were you blocking the malware as it got infected, or preventing that endpoint from getting infected at that point? Or was it a case of actually you were infected for 3 weeks before and you're only picking it up now? So with FortiEDR, we've got sort of focused on sort of the core out-of-the-box security policies that we have. So from a traditional sort of anti-malware protection, so that's really where our execution prevention policies come in. So that's ultimately designed to prevent FortiEDR from prevent your endpoint solution from getting compromised in the first place. Okay, but no security vendor can go and guarantee 100% protection. So that's where if something is allowed to run, this is really where the detection and response capabilities of FortiEDR comes in. So where we've got our exfiltration prevention policies and also a specific ransomware prevention policy as well. So if any code is allowed to run, so it's not blocked because we don't think it's 100% malicious, so we're going to allow it to run. This is where we've got additional policies that can start to look to see, okay, well, what is that endpoint doing on the network, or that specific process that it's trying to do. And also FortiEDR is a kernel level visibility. So there's about 5 patents that I think FortiEDR has that sort of provides a unique level of prevention when it particularly comes to things like ransomware or sort of exfiltration prevention, because these are really the behaviors that we're monitoring that typically malware tries to trigger. And with our kernel level of visibility and our sort of zero trust type approach, we're not going to allow any of these suspicious behaviors to basically be able to run unless we've specifically authorized that sort of process. And we've got some clever stuff in the back end from our Fortinet cloud service that can automate the whole sort of process of, is that a legitimate file or is that kind of malicious, that can kind of guide us through how we allow certain processes to actually go and run. Okay, but let me actually jump into my demo quickly. So let me just bring up my machine across here. So I've got my endpoint here that's running my FortiEDR. So again, one of the first things customers typically go and say, okay, I now need to put another agent onto my machine. How heavy is this agent going to be? Well, FortiEDR is specifically designed to provide both that endpoint protection, so your anti-malware protection, and the detection and response post-compromise capabilities, all with a single lightweight agent. Okay. You can see here, so these are my sort of core FortiEDR processes, and typically the agent doesn't use more than sort of like 1% CPU, and from a memory footprint, it's around about sort of 70 to sort of 100 meg. So FortiEDR is really sort of one of the lightest EDR agents sort of on the market. And then also in addition to protecting the Windows, we protect the Linux, the Mac environments as well. And also uniquely with the Windows devices, we can also protect sort of anything Windows XP Service Pack 2 and above. So quite common, you see those devices in retail or OT type environments. Okay. So on my endpoint here, so let me just bring up quickly. So I'm kind of simulating maybe it's a user who's gone off, he's got a printer at home, he's trying to download what he thinks is a driver for his printer because he just can't get his printer to kind of work. So if you see, so from a typical AV perspective, well, how we're able to go and scan on any sort of file reads or kind of file writes, we can see, okay, well, that file is attempting to be written there, and we can see FortiEDR is going and blocking that specific event. And I can jump into back to my dashboard here, and we can see, okay, that generic print driver.exe was blocked, and we've got our sort of process graph that kind of shows the whole sort of chain of things. We can see, okay, it was a explorer.exe that tried to sort of access that generic printer driver.exe, and it was effectively gone and blocked. Okay, and we can also see what specific threat it was that was flagged up. So we've got our Conti ransomware. I think it's one of the more prominent ransomware families at the moment. But let's go and do something that's a bit more interesting. So if we go to our security policies, okay, so here I've got my specific execution prevention policy that's applied to that endpoint that's in my finance group. I'm now going to go and switch that policy to be in simulation mode. Okay, so what simulation mode is going to do, it's going to still be logging and telling us if any of these specific execution prevention rules would have been triggered, but we're really going to be relying on our exfiltration prevention or our ransomware prevention policies that are kind of that fallback mechanism that where that endpoint gets compromised, we're going to be limiting the damage that can happen. So if that specific process tries to do any sort of file encryption, we're going to go and block that activity. Or if it tries to do any sort of lateral movement, FortiEDR is going to kick in and then block those sort of second or third stages of that sort of compromise. Okay. And if I jump back to my endpoint here, so hopefully my security policy should have kicked in now. So we can just give that a quick test. Okay, so now we're in sort of that simulation mode from an execution prevention. And what I'm going to do now is effectively just go and run that exe file. So you can see FortiEDR has immediately popped up and said that connection blocked for that process. So that specific process was trying to now communicate on the network, and FortiEDR has flagged it up and kind of blocked it. Also to kind of pick up probably a more common day-to-day type attack. So probably one of the more common areas that organizations or the attacks that organizations are facing on a common basis is sort of those phishing or spear phishing or emails with some sort of weaponized type attachment. Okay, so in my case here, you can see we've got an email where someone's requesting a quote and it looks pretty legitimate. So they're talking around all their technical specifications and all of that sort of stuff. And then they've attached this Excel file. And I've gone and opened up this Excel file, and it comes with the standard sort of warnings around, okay, it's come from the internet, you need to enable editing. We need to go and enable the macro content. But also interesting is if we kind of look how obfuscated the background is. So if they asking for quotes around and they're given their specific specs, and you a certain business, maybe it's to try and hide the sort of stuff behind it, so it doesn't appear kind of completely sort of malicious or kind of you can't understand the context behind it, which is kind of why they're masking that content. But let's go and enable that macro, and then we can kind of see typically what happens in the background is you'd get the macro script would go and run, and typically that would then go and trigger PowerShell or trigger some sort of other capability in Windows that would actually lead to that endpoint being compromised. We should see, and there we go, we've had the pop-up there where PowerShell has been trying to access the internet, and that activity has gone and been blocked. Okay, so that was like two different kind of scenarios that we've kind of looked at there. So if I jump back to my dashboard, and we can see we've now had a number of security events that have populated the dashboard. And if I drill into those, and we can now see those recent security events that were picked up. So previously I had that generic print driver where we've gone and sort of blocked it on the file read. But now we can actually see sort of what happened sort of like as the second stage if that code is allowed to run. So if it was an unknown type of malware, but just we've switched our policies to being sort of in log or kind of simulation mode. So in this case here, I can see that generic print driver was trying to access my WMI service. It was then trying to access sort of my bootloader on my endpoint. And then we can also see it was even, in this case here, it was actually triggering our file encryption rule as it was trying to overwrite or encrypt my cat.jpg file that I had on my endpoint. And that specific activity was blocked because we had our ransomware prevention policy in a prevent mode. Okay. Let's see, and so the last aspect of that generic print driver is also coming. You can see it's actually going to drop that readme.exe, which is where it would typically go and say, okay, well, this is the details on how you need to go and actually pay your Bitcoin as such as well. Okay. Also looking at, if I change my view to actually show it from a process perspective. Okay, and where I had the command.exe was launched, so I had that PowerShell process was run. So you can see the attacker is trying to leverage some clever stuff to mask the process name from being normal PowerShell. He's kind of sort of put some context. So if we had a SIM tool that was just looking for PowerShell activity, it wouldn't actually go and pick it up. And we can see that PowerShell was trying to launch command.exe, but because we're in simulation mode on our execution policy, that activity was allowed to happen. It was just kind of saying that we would have typically gone and blocked that. And then from the subsequent PowerShell activity, we can actually see again that obfuscated PowerShell string that was run. We can then see a network access attempt, and PowerShell was basically trying to go and access the network there. And then on the some key things from the classification perspective. Okay, so on the rule that was triggered, we can now also see, okay, it was our exfiltration prevention, and then a suspicious application was trying to make a suspicious sort of connection, and then we can see the associated MITRE techniques that were triggered that we should potentially go and investigate to understand how attackers leverage off those sort of techniques. The other core part of FortiEDR is this automated classification that we have that happens in the background. Okay, so the agent itself is self-defending. So if you're on the network or you're kind of off the network, the agent is still going to be able to protect that endpoint. But when you are on the network, we can then take advantage of the capabilities of our Fortinet cloud service. So that's when we'll send metadata of any security event that we pick up. We kind of send that to our cloud service to provide that kind of automated triage for. So in our case, yeah, that activity was initially flagged up as sort of inconclusive by the agent, and then we sent that metadata up to the cloud service. So then within, about 12 seconds later, the cloud service will actually be able to come back and determine, hold on, that activity wasn't just inconclusive, we can actually determine that it was malicious. And now that we've determined it's malicious, we can take a more automated response on sort of cleaning up or kind of isolating that machine. So from my side here, I can go and say, okay, if I wanted to go and bring up a forensics type view, and I can see the events kind of happening from there, and I can go down to each sort of step that's kind of happened there, and I can see the command line arguments that were being sort of issued with that, and I can now go and do sort of a manual process to say maybe isolate that machine, retrieve the file of that machine, or go and remediate that specific sort of file. One of the more interesting ones as well from a PowerShell perspective is, if I bring it there, sort of one that I had a little bit earlier is so where, again, a malicious sort of PowerShell script was run, where it then went and actually tried to delete my volume shadow copies. So if you're relying on shadow copies as a protection mechanism for sort of ransomware or being able to kind of revert back to a known good state, if this malware was allowed to run, it would have gone and deleted that volume shadow copy. So FortiEDR actually works in quite a unique way where we don't actually rely on the shadow copies. From a ransomware perspective, we receive files targeted from a ransomware attack. We can do sort of a real-time rollback of those files. And that was kind of one of the patents that FortiEDR has in that sort of space. So I showed you how you can kind of do sort of a manual policy to go and say, or manual approach to go and remediate sort of those files. But where we probably get a bit more efficient is how we can actually utilize playbooks. Okay, so I've switched on to my security playbooks, and we can apply different playbooks to different collector groups. Yeah. Okay, so the classification we're going to have for those different security events would be sort of either malicious or suspect, or maybe it's sort of an unwanted program. Typically, that's things like LogMeIn or TeamViewer, where it could be used maliciously, but it could also be an authorized application. But we want to flag it up, so you would then need to go and authorize that application. So on these playbooks, we can then go and say, okay, well, if I pick up something that's malicious, I want to firstly delete that file. I want to terminate anything that's running in memory. And then maybe I want to do some more advanced isolation. So that could be, like I say, isolating the device so you can only actually talk to the FortiEDR management stack so we can do these investigations. Maybe we move it into a higher security group where we have more stricter policies around those endpoints. Or we can go and choose to automatically block the IP address that might be phoning home to. So those command and control servers, we can automatically integrate into the FortiGate environment to go and block those IPs. Okay. On the other aspect around where FortiEDR comes in is this concept of communication control. So again, it's understanding exactly what applications are on your endpoints, and specifically those applications that are communicating. Okay, because ultimately it's going to be an application phoning home, whether it's downloading a payload or whether it's exfiltrating data or obtaining sort of an encryption key that to go and do the ransomware type attack. That's those applications will communicate. But also similarly, you could have a vulnerable application that could lead to the endpoint being compromised. So FortiEDR will go and tell us exactly all the applications that you have in your environment and those applications talking, and we can then go and determine exactly which version of those applications are running. We can determine, is it a signed application, and then also importantly the reputation, and then the vulnerability for that specific application. So in my case here, I've got Firefox 50, and we can see all of these critical vulnerabilities that sort of targets that vulnerable version of Firefox. And also I can go and look to see exactly where it might be deployed in our environment and sort of what additional destinations it might be phoning home to. So if I wanted to then take a policy to go and say, okay, well, I just don't want to allow that vulnerable version of Firefox to communicate, I can go and modify my action there to go and say, I specifically want to deny that version of Firefox. But if I wanted to be a bit more proactive about things, this is where we can apply policies that can actually go and say, okay, well, for the different endpoint groups that we have, I'm going to now go and apply whether it's a laptop policy or kind of a server policy that will go and look to see, okay, well, in my case, I've created an exfiltration apps policy where I'm not going to allow any applications to talk on the network if the reputation is less than or equal to 1, or where they've got a greater than or equal to vulnerability equal to sort of critical. And then applications would automatically get added to this list as they identified. It's not a case of me having to go and add them to that list. If a critical vulnerability comes out for Chrome tomorrow, it automatically gets added to that sort of list. But then also specifically, I can go and say, okay, well, I've identified applications that I just don't want to be able to sort of run in my environment. So if I go have a look at the applications of this specific policy, and particularly taking on sort of what I touched on the endpoint challenges and kind of the threat landscape, where we've identified, okay, a lot of the times it's legitimate applications that the attackers are kind of looking to leverage. So in my case, yeah, we maybe don't allow TeamViewer. So I've set my policy to go and say I'm not going to allow TeamViewer to run. I'm not allowing any applications with critical vulnerabilities to go and run. And then also I might not allow MegaSync or those cloud backup applications to run. And then also ransomware, if an attacker gets hold of an endpoint and sort of gets those elevated credentials, quite often they're going to use PSExec. So PSExec is a free utility from Microsoft or the sysinternals toolkit that they provide. And a lot of times attackers are using PSExec to go and install the ransomware across any sort of machine in their environment. So we can specifically go and say, well, we don't use PSExec. We're going to go and block that from happening environment. So we're trying to ultimately reduce our whole sort of attack surface area and make it harder for these sort of attackers to kind of do what they look to do. And then there's also just lastly from understanding about what's on our network as well. So this is where we can go and pick up sort of our unmanaged devices. So this will actually go and show us what other endpoints are in our environment that aren't running any sort of FortiEDR agent, where ultimately those endpoints could be sort of a jump point for the compromise, or similarly, it could even be IoT devices as well, because ultimately anything with an IP address, in theory, could be compromised, and it's that sort of compromise that could lead to the network or further sort of compromises within our environment as well. Okay, so I think that was just it from sort of like that short demo to kind of show you how specifically how FortiEDR has sort of more than just anti-malware protection, that we're going beyond just the AV element to actually understanding everything that's happening on that endpoint, that complete attack lifecycle or that compromised lifecycle. So if something is allowed to run, we're going to be limiting the damage, what it can do on the network from our exploitation prevention policies, and then also specifically from the ransomware side of things, where we can go and prevent any sort of encryption type activities from happening. I think just to go back to my slide quick to kind of wrap up. Is that all okay from your side, Dave? So,
yeah, that looks great. Platform supports Windows, Mac, Linux.
Yeah, so just to recap there, so like I say, the platform support is Windows, Mac, and Linux devices. On the Windows side, we're doing everything from XP Service Tac 2 and above. It is a single lightweight agent, so it's not a case of having two agents, two management stacks to kind of provide the EDR. It's all within one management application and one single agent that we do. It's typically deployed sort of as a SaaS solution, or we do have a hybrid type approach where we can set certain components onto the customer's network just to make sure things work optimally as well. And then I think probably last thing also just to wrap up and sort of bring, I suppose, Ben, if you want to sort of jump in here just to highlight where the managed service element comes in, or that what FirstNet will be looking to provide. So with FortiEDR, there's kind of two stages to kind of how we triage a lot of these sort of threats. So the initial activity will be classified on the endpoint, where the endpoint will go and say, okay, something is trying to happen. We're going to go and block that activity, or we're going to maybe flag something as suspicious or kind of inconclusive. Then the second stage is we actually send up metadata around that event to the Fortinet cloud service, where that will then actually provide additional sort of classification to go and say, actually, well, that activity that we flagged up that was suspicious is actually malicious. And now let's go and take our response action to go and delete the file or isolate that endpoint. But also similarly, it can work to sort of downgrade the threat. So if we pick up something that's maybe as inconclusive, but when we flag it up to the cloud service has, because again, one of the benefits of the cloud is you're not limited to the resources or what you can basically put in the cloud. So within that, we've got file reputation databases, you've got all the AI, machine learning type stuff. And that can actually go and recognize that event that we saw is actually legitimate. And then the cloud service can then also manage your whole exception process. So the cloud service can go and say, actually, well, that update.exe that needs to go and run, that's triggering our file encryption rules, we can actually automate the exception for you so we don't actually start blocking that legitimate activity again. But when it would then come up to sort of FirstNet as such, so once we've kind of gone through that whole classification process, that's typically where sort of like the FirstNet would actually come in and provide that whole managed detection response to provide that eyes on glass and to actually go and look at that event and provide the sort of the human perspective on looking at the context of that alert and sort of providing the response process, I guess, for that as well.
Yeah, so I think it's important to mention, so we will obviously provide a managed service to customers as they wish. So we were talking about fatigue when it comes to IT divisions and one-man bands that are looking after every aspect of their business. We can quite happily offer a full managed service that will take the weight off the guy's shoulders and at least give them some security in the thought that we are watching over them and we are ensuring that the processes that take place with the solution are always monitored and always approved from our dedicated team.
Great, I think that's a wrap, guys. Dale, Ben, thanks for joining me today. And yeah, if you're interested, please reach out to your account manager or your reseller, and we can keep in touch.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks, Marshall.